Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Tuesday, November 24th on a rainy Vancouver morning. Let's see, what do I have to tell you? Right, so two quick announcements at the beginning here. Number one, don't forget that we won't have any class on Friday because I won't be here, but maybe you can use that time to work on your final papers. That'd be a good use of time. Also, I'd like to move our quiz next week to Wednesday instead. We were trying to work it out in history this morning to not have quizzes on the same day, and so we wound up scheduling the history quiz on Tuesday. So we're going to do it on Wednesday next week, if that's okay. I'll post in Microsoft Teams the range of classes that we'll be responsible for. I'll do that just after class today, but we'll do the quiz on Wednesday, and of course this Friday, no class, okay? Cool as quizzes get? Okay, good. So Daniel's here. Good morning, Daniel. Hang on a sec. Let's see if I can fix that blue screen behind me. Daniel's here. Good morning. John is here. Good morning, John. Gabrielle is here. Good morning, Gabrielle. Oh, good. It works now. Awesome. George is here. Good morning, George. Daniel is here. Good morning, Daniel. And Adel is here. Hello, Adel. Good morning. And Vicky is here. Hello, Vicky. And Chan is here. Good morning, Chan. Okay. Let me see. Okay. So yesterday we were talking a little bit about racists and white supremacists, right? And it came out of that article we read on white supremacy, and one of the groups we were talking about were these guys called the AltRight, right? And again, there's lots of perfectly reasonable, normal quote unquote people who are, lean slightly to the right, people who are conservatives or kind of normal Republicans in the States. Lots of people lean slightly to the right, and that's fine. But some people lean particularly far to the right. And so again, if you go all the way out on the right, you bump into fascism and fascist states, right? So, leaning a little bit to the right is not a big deal, but the further you go, kind of the more extreme these ideologies and approaches become, right? So yeah, the people out on what they call the alt-right now they're not really what you would call mainstream conservatives. They're kind of further out on the right. Again, they tend to be against or oppose all kinds of things. Sometimes it's immigration. Sometimes they're misogynist. Sometimes they are white supremacists. They might be anti-Semites. They might be Islamophobes, if you will. They might be anti-democracy or anti-government or just anarchists. There's all kinds of people mixed together here on the alt-right, and usually they're reacting against one thing or a series of things, okay? And so the video we were watching yesterday kind of centered around this statue in Charlottetown or Charlottesville? I keep screwing it up. Charlottesville, South Carolina? North Carolina? North Carolina? Yeah, Charlottesville, North Carolina. And so, again, this is a statue of a Confederate war general, General Robert E. Lee. But again, the southern states in the Civil War fought to keep slaves, right? And so here is this guy kind of put up on a pedestal in their, the central park of the town, as a hero, right? Not as a bad guy, but as a good guy, as someone to literally look up to. And so we said that the whole issue around this statue was the suggestion that maybe it should be taken down, right? Maybe the fact that a Confederate general who fought for slavery doesn't really reflect the values of the country and the state and the city that we now live in. Maybe we should take the statue down. And of course, that created a very strong reaction from some of these alt-right guys and from white supremacists. And so there was a number of rallies that occurred around this statue leading up to the events that we saw in the documentary. And so in the documentary, that was shot, I believe, in August of 2017. And so we saw white supremacists walking around chanting things like "Jews will not replace us" and all kinds of other kind of white supremacist things. But we also saw another group of protesters who turned out to oppose these white supremacists, right? People who were demonstrating for Black Lives Matter. They were demonstrating for anti-racism. They were demonstrating for equality. And they were in support of taking this statue down, right? And so as we not only hear about, but as we actually saw, things get a little out of hand to the point where a car drives into the crowd and injures a bunch of protesters and manages to kill one young woman here, Heather Heyer. And so in that documentary, we got to hear some of the things that these white supremacists were saying. And again, we I don't know that we came to a conclusion about it, but we did ask the question at least to say, what is the purpose of this documentary, right? What purpose does it serve, and should it be shown, right? And again, you can have different perspectives on that, and that's okay. But in the process of watching it, what did we learn about? What kind of ideologies did we hear these white supremacists expressing? What kind of values or beliefs did they have? They were what? We heard that, yes, we heard them claim. I wish I could remember the guy's name, the main guy that they were speaking with. Yeah, he claimed that they were nonviolent, but what did he also claim?
They wanted non-white people to get out of the country.
Right, so they were talking about, so they claimed they were nonviolent. They also claimed that they would be violent or were prepared to be violent, and they were certainly armed in order to be violent. They also, yeah, they here's a fancy word for you, espoused, they sort of expressed a number of clearly racist white supremacist views, right? The idea that white people were superior and that, you know, other non-white people need to get out of the country, right? What else did we hear them talk about, or other beliefs they had?
Dehumanization of the
Yeah. We heard them dehumanize not just Jewish people, but a number of different groups, right? He talked about he was referring to people as animals or savage animals, right? And again, that's not too specific, but it is a dehumanization of people. And again, it's dangerous, right? It should set off alarm bells for us, because it's much easier to marginalize or hurt or even kill people when you see them as less than human, okay? And so the idea that, or the fact that this guy is seeing these other groups and other people as less than human is a concern, right? What else? Anything else?
They were opposing communism. I don't know.
Yeah, they opposed a number of ideologies as well, and communism was one of them, right? And so when that guy got pepper sprayed in the eyes, who did this to you? Commies, right? It was communists. And yeah, so there's communism that they're opposing. What else do they oppose? Or what other ideologies do they oppose?
Not taking the statue down.
Right, so they don't want to take the statue down because they're usually the excuse that gets used for not taking a statue like that down is that, oh, they're trying to erase our history. That's often what is used. And maybe we can come back to that in a second. But yeah, they don't want the statue taken down. They're anti-communist. What else are they anti? Probably anti-immigration. Yeah, they want people to go. They want non-white people to leave the country, not to come in, right? What else? What else do they oppose? Okay, maybe that's maybe that's good enough. Yeah, they're clearly in opposition to equality. They're clearly in opposition to the Black Lives Matter group. They're clearly in opposition to immigration, to communism or Bolshevism. All of these things are kind of getting mixed together in terms of the things that these guys are against. Why do we say that Trump's statement was problematic? That when he said that they were, when he condemned the violence on many sides, or when he said, oh, there were many fine people on both sides. What's kind of the problem with that?
It gives them power, like he's not taking any sides, so they think that it's okay to just protest in a way that is harmful.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is the question is that he's trying to get up there and not take a side, but should he be taking a side? Right? There's one group that is super racist and white supremacist and neo-Nazis, and then there's a bunch of people who are protesting for equality, right? And peacefulness and opportunities for everyone and an end to racism, hopefully. And so, is there a right side to be on? I kind of think there is, right? And you might disagree with me, and certainly the white supremacists will disagree with me. But, sometimes you want to be, sometimes you don't want to take a side. Sometimes you don't want to inflame people's, inflame controversy around an issue. But sometimes you do, right? Sometimes there is a clear moral stance to be taken. And when one side is advocating for violence and racism and misogyny and sexism, and then one side is saying, hey, let's try to find ways where everyone can have equality of opportunity, I think there's a right side to be on. And again, you don't always have to pick a side, but I think sometimes you do. And I think that was a moment for him where he needed to come out clearly and say, look, white supremacy is not okay, neo-Nazism is not okay, and this woman was killed, right? This woman was killed in a protest, and so again, you can have your beliefs, but when you take them out into the street and you say them, sometimes they become hate speech, right? And you're not allowed to speak in a way. You're not allowed to use hate speech, right? And you're certainly not allowed to threaten others with violence, right? You're allowed to come out and express your point of view. You're allowed to assemble peacefully. You're not allowed to be violent for any reason, right? And so he kind of dropped, as usual, Trump kind of dropped the ball on that one, right? And there was a side that I think needed to be taken, and a lot of people think he needed to take, but he didn't do it. How would you answer this question, number 4? Why was the statue the cause of so much controversy? It's just a statue, isn't it?
But as the woman said, it's like looking down on them. So there's just always something that it reminds them, and it affects like other people's point of view of immigrants. So that causes like violence.
Right. So, yeah, the woman that they talked to, I missed her name. The African American woman they talked to, she said, yeah, this guy is up there, and 170 or 80 years ago, this guy fought to keep people like her in chains, literally in chains. He fought for that, and we've put him up here in the center of the city, looking down on us, or us looking up at him as if he's some sort of hero, and this feels awful to have this guy looking down on me all the time, right? And again, I want to draw your attention back to the idea of positionality and the idea of people experiencing reality differently, right? And so, when you and I look at this, you probably don't think anything of it, right? It's a guy on a horse, right? Like whatever, right? It doesn't mean anything specific to probably most of us, but for the residents of Charlottesville, it means something different. And again, depending on your race, you're going to see this statue differently. And a lot of white people in Charlottesville see this as, this is a piece of our history. This is a piece of our Southern pride. This is a piece of our identity. And many Black Americans who live in Charlottesville also say, yeah, this is a piece of our history. This is a guy who, you know, wanted to continue to own us, who wanted to continue to keep us as property. And you've put him up there on a pedestal like he's a hero, right? And so people are going to look at this statue and see very different things, right?
And it's also like they're promoting slavery, that like they're really okay with it.
Exactly, right? What does this statue say, right? Is this saying that this guy fought to preserve slavery and that's okay? What an awesome dude. Well, I think it's maybe not meant to say that, but does it communicate that message anyway? We talked about that before too, right? Sometimes the message that you think you're sending is not the message that people receive, right? And we talked about that with Ariana Grande, strangely enough, but you know, maybe the message she's trying to send isn't the message that people are receiving. And so here, this statue, I don't know what message it's trying to send, but it's receiving a number of different messages, and it depends on who you are, what message you receive, right? So we look at it here and we think, yeah, whatever, it's an old statue of a guy on a horse, boring, right? But for the people of Charlottesville, it reads quite differently, right? And so for Black Americans, they look at that and they're like, you know what, this guy wanted to enslave us, and this city thinks he's a hero. And how does that feel, right? How does that feel in 2018 or 2017 when this was happening, right? Why do you think these white supremacists see the world the way that they do? Because a lot of the things that they seem to argue for, the fact that, you know, the white race is superior and all these other peoples are inferior, and the idea that white people are victimized and under threat and maybe even in the process of, you know, undergoing a genocide and all of these things, why do they see the world that way, do you think?
Maybe they're looking at it as only their point of view, they're not looking at the other's point of view.
Okay, so they're only seeing things from their point of view. That's probably true, right? What else do you think?
Recently, especially, people start fighting for equality, so their privilege or power is at risk. And once you feel you've been living that way for so many years, and you just accept it as a fact. And when someone tells you, no, we deserve that right too, you're not so special anymore. I don't think that feels very good.
Yeah, so there's a bit of you're kind of bumping into their socialization in a way, right? In one way, white people have enjoyed social and political and economic power in the United States for quite some time. And for the most part, they still do, statistically speaking. However, the perception that they may be losing their power is perhaps frightening, right? People who have power don't really like to lose it. People who have things don't really like to lose it. And in fact, humans are very risk averse in that way. We don't really like to lose anything that we've already acquired, whether it's power or resources or whatever. And so, yeah, people who start to believe that maybe they're under threat, yeah, can react very, very strongly. Why else do you think? Wait, there was two things that you said, Avera. There was that, and then you said something else. Shoot, is it gone now?
I think it's also when people tell them that they're not deserving of their power.
Right.
And you accept it as a fact.
Right. So, yeah, it's part of what's going on here might be as well the idea that when the dominant group is kind of implicated in an unequal relationship, it's very possible that people will have a reaction to it. And some people, again, will feel guilty. Some people will feel confused. Some people won't want to deal with the issue at all and they'll just ignore it. And then some people will get really angry, right, at the idea that somehow they're the bad guy in all this. Because again, social messaging tells them that in fact they're not. They're the good guy, right? All those movies say that white people are the good guys, right? And so to be kind of painted as the bad guy in this situation is also uncomfortable and yeah, threatening maybe. Can you think of any other? Can you think of any other things?
Maybe the society.
Well, they've certainly absorbed social messages from somewhere, right? They've certainly been kind of indoctrinated into this white supremacist worldview by people around them or by the internet or some such thing. So they've, yeah, there's social messaging involved here.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, always.
Where did the idea of white being superior to other colors come from?
Ooh, we should know. I think we know that. Why? Where does the idea of the white race being better than others come from?
They came to Africa and found that they controlled indigenous people and everyone else, kind of thing.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit earlier about the idea that race and racism is kind of created as a tool to justify colonization, right? So white people leaving Western Europe, taking over other countries, treating the people there very poorly, and then, kind of needing a reason to do that, right? Why are we treating these people so poorly? Why is it okay just to come into somebody else's country and kill a bunch of them and take their stuff? Why is that okay, right? And so the ideology develops that, oh, well, actually these people are less than us. So we don't really need to concern ourselves that much because they're not as good as we are, right? They're not as civilized or intelligent or human or whatever, right? And so it kind of comes from there. Well, and that might be another a good answer to this question, right? Why do these guys feel the way they do? Because the idea of white supremacy is built into the very DNA of the United States and of Canada, right? And so because those ideas are kind of, again, baked into the culture, they are hard to get rid of, right? And they're very hard to recognize. They're very hard to see in action. And again, that's why we need to look at sort of broader statistics in society, because sometimes racism is very clear, and in the video that we saw, racism is super clear, right? Those guys they're not hiding their racism in any way, but sometimes it's a little less, that's okay. Sometimes it's a little less obvious, right? And so I'll share something with you a little bit later that maybe will explain this much better than I am. What else do you think? Why else might these guys believe or see the world the way that they see it?
Maybe the growing population and like they're working together. They might take on some jobs that white people were doing.
Ah, interesting. So one of the sort of stereotypical complaints that people who are racist or anti-immigration have is that, oh, these immigrants are all coming into our country and they're stealing our jobs, right? They're taking all our jobs, right? And so why are we doing this? Why are we letting all these people come in and take our jobs, right? That's a very stereotypical complaint. And one of the things I wanted to add in here was that I think, and I might be wrong about this, but I think there's an economic element to what's happening here. And if you look at what's happened to the economy of the United States, let's say in the past 70 years or so, it's actually changed quite a bit. And so all the way through the 1900s and the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, the US was big into manufacturing. Okay, so the US had a very strong manufacturing sector. Lots of people were working in factories, producing all kinds of different things. Lots of people were buying American because that was, that was a patriotic thing to do. And so America had a very strong manufacturing sector. But today, where is everything made?
By machine.
China, by machine, yes, but also China or Taiwan, maybe a little bit of Japan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, some stuff in India, lots of stuff in China though, right? Almost everything is made in China at this point. So knowing that means that all of those manufacturing jobs that the US used to have now disappeared, right? They have gone overseas, they've gone to China. And a lot of other jobs have been outsourced as well, right? So often when you call TELUS, when you need help, because you're, hey, help me with my internet problem, TELUS, you're not calling Vancouver, it's going to a call center somewhere else in a cheaper country, right? And so again, a lot of jobs that Americans used to have disappeared, right? They've gone to other economies. And the thing is that a lot of those jobs were jobs for kind of, there was a time in the US where kind of what you did was, you went to school, you got your high school diploma, and you went off and you got a job in the factory, right? And you got married and you bought a house. The factory job paid really well and it had good benefits, and you could usually buy a house for your wife and have kids. And then after you worked at the factory for 40 years or 45 years, you would be able to retire and you'd get a pension from the factory. And it was a nice, comfortable, predictable kind of life trajectory for most people. And lots of people did that, and their fathers did it and their grandfathers did it, and it was almost a generational thing. But of course, very recently, we know a lot of those jobs have kind of disappeared and they've gone to countries like China. And so for a lot of those people who used to, come out of high school and go right into the factory and get a good, secure, decent paying job with good benefits and a pension, those jobs are gone. And what's happened, unfortunately, is those people who used to occupy the middle class, those jobs have disappeared and they've kind of slid down a little bit. So those people have kind of slipped down the economic ladder into jobs that pay less well, that don't have as good benefits or don't have any benefits, that don't have a pension, and often they are now competing with immigrants who are coming into the country and often occupy sort of the lower sector of jobs as well. So two things have happened. New people are coming into the country, but also the jobs that this middle class used to have are now gone. And so, and predominantly a white middle class. And so what's happened in the United States is that some people have gotten wildly rich. I'm looking at you, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, and Elon Musk and people like that. Some people have gotten wildly, wildly rich, and the people who used to be in the middle class, they've kind of fallen down, right? They've fallen down the economic ladder, and there's really no way for them to climb without kind of access to education and things like that. And so I often wonder that a lot of these guys who are anti-immigration and become racist, I almost wonder if they kind of feel that they've been cheated, right? That they felt that a certain type of life was promised to them, like their grandfather who worked in the factory and had a solid, stable way of making a living, and their father did the same thing, and now that's not available to them, right? The factory is gone. It's gone to China or somewhere else. And what are they what are they to do, right? And so this kind of very predictable, comfortable way of entering the middle class is now gone, right? And the United States, their economy has changed as well. They're not so much a manufacturing, they're not really a manufacturing economy anymore. They're more of a service industry, information tech economy at the moment, right? They've changed a little bit. But again, I think there's a lot of people who have been left behind by that change, and I would bet a lot of them are white males, and white males who felt that they were entitled to something that now they're not getting. And again, whether they were entitled to it in the first place is another question, but I almost feel like they feel cheated for this reason, that they, you know, that they lost something that should have been theirs, and it was taken away from them by people of color. And so I almost wonder if there's a little bit of that mixed in as well, right? And again, there's lots of other pieces to this. You know, again, America has changed quite a bit. Culture has changed quite a bit. Women have gained status and power, although still not equal, but they have been gaining status and power. That has redefined what it is to be a man and in some ways that many men don't actually understand. You know, they're kind of lost, right? Their gender role has changed to the point where they don't really understand what they're supposed to be. And so sometimes you find them gravitating towards hyper-masculine, hyper-aggressive ideologies, just like this one. And so, you know, not to complicate things too much, but I think there's a lot of different things going on here. There's definitely some racism. There's definitely systemic racism that is baked into the fabric of the US and of Canada as well. And then you have kind of a changing economy, and you have changing gender roles, and you have some people who, you know, used to feel pretty comfortable that they would get a certain type of life, and now that's not guaranteed anymore for them. And so a lot of people that wouldn't have been left behind in the 1950s or 60s now are, and they want to know why, right? They want to know who's responsible for that. And in this case, some of them have decided that it's people of color, right? Or it's immigrants, or it's women, or it's democracy itself, or it's all of those things, right? And so, again, I think there's, you know, a community of people who felt that there's things that they should have got, right? That they were owed a certain type of life, and now they don't get that, right? And again, whether their feelings are valid or not is up to you to decide. But I also think that there's a little bit of that mixed in as well, right? There's a certain amount of, I thought I was going to get a certain type of life. Now I don't get that. Nobody seems to care, right? And instead, it seems like there's, you know, new immigrants coming into my country, and they're doing all this stuff, and I'm left behind, right? I think that might be a bit of the feeling as well. And again, I'm not saying that that's a valid feeling or an invalid feeling, but I think it is partially what's behind some of these guys, I would think. Let's see. Oh yeah. So just as a bit of a bookend to this documentary that we watched here, I just thought I would give you some information here. So this was kind of the development during that period where they were demonstrating, and a little bit after as well. So you can see here, I've got some things that are a little out of sequence. Right, so initially there was a debate to whether the statue should come down or not. People, you know, there were controversy, there was positions on both sides. The city council in 2017 decided that they should cover this statue, and which they did. But then it was ruled later that that they had to remove it because it's either it's a historical landmark or it's under the war memorials are protected by state law. So the city of Charlottesville didn't have jurisdiction to do anything to this statue. The statue technically belongs to the state. And so they had to go to state court in order to remove the statue. And I think, I don't have an update on this, but I think the statue, actually I don't even know what's happened to the statue. I'd have to look it up. It's gone back and forth so many times that I've forgotten what has happened. Okay, what I'll do now is I'll just kind of try to wrap up this whole racism thing in a very ineffective way, because as we can see, it's a massive topic. And you know, we've just talked about the US and Canada. We've talked about how and why race has been constructed. And of course, the racism that people face is in some ways very similar, but it also depends on the group that you belong to, right? So here in Canada, certainly we have racism and prejudice and discrimination that is directed toward Indigenous people, and we kind of focused on that here. But that's not to say that Black Canadians or Asian Canadians or South Asian Canadians, it's not to say that they don't experience their own struggles as well, because they definitely do. It's just that I chose to shine the spotlight on a few things just to kind of give us an idea of what's going on. And so, just because we have discrimination against one group in Canada doesn't mean that the others are fine, because they're certainly not. But again, we talked about how and why race was constructed, and the idea that there's no biological basis to the idea that there are human races, right? So again, all of us in this room, for the most part, we're from different parts of the world. We all carry genes that come from those parts of the world, and so those genes might have to do with our skin color or our hair or the texture of our hair or the color of our eyes or the shape of our eyes or our nose or our face or all kinds of things. We carry some genes that come from certain parts of the world, and they connect us to those places, right? But again, those genes there's not many of them, and they don't really make a meaningful difference between us. And so any one of us in this room could be, well, all of us in this room are basically 99.9% genetically similar, right? And basically the 0.1% that we're different really has to do with individual differences, not differences that can be connected to different parts of the world. And so racially speaking, there's really no difference between us, right? And so because we're such visual creatures, we look at someone who has a different color skin and we think, wow, that's a big difference, right? But again, genetically speaking, it's not a big difference. We're just, again, we're visual creatures, and we give more importance to that than there really is, right? So we looked a little bit at the US and Canada, and we looked at white supremacy. And again, it's very easy to see racism play out when people are clearly being racist, right? So the documentary we just saw, yeah, there's all kinds of racism in there. It's very clear, it's very overt, it's easy to identify, and it's easy to condemn. But the sort of systemic racism is more difficult to see. And so here I'm going to throw some more statistics at you. And so have a look at in the United States here. And so in the US, the average life expectancy for Americans is almost 80 years, which is pretty good, right? That's well above the global average. But as you can see here, there's a pretty significant difference between the life expectancy for Black people and the life expectancy for white people, right? That's a big difference. And again, that's a massive data set, right? This is what do they call it? The Bureau of Statistics and Research or something? They keep track of statistics for the entire country of the United States. These are big data sets. So the fact that we're seeing like a 4-year difference between black people and white people in the US, it's a big difference, right? Something is going on, right? There's some reason why white people are living longer, right? You can also see here there's a difference between males and females. You see that just about in every country in the world. You'll see that women will statistically live longer than men. So sorry, guys.
Wait, do you know why?
know. I do not know why. I assume it's because we're evolutionarily more expendable. Often what you see in most societies, men will often have more dangerous or physically taxing jobs. Men often will do things that are less good for their health. Sometimes they'll engage in kind of macho behavior. Men are more likely to smoke. Men are more likely to drink. And so there might be a little bit of both. There might be a little bit of genetics here, but there also might be some cultural factors involved. There certainly are, if you look at, if you want a big shock, look at the life expectancies for the Russian Republic. In Russia, you'll see that, again, women live longer than men, but it's by a good 8 or 9 years. It's a massive difference. So Russian men die quite a bit earlier than Russian women do.
Yeah, because they drink too much.
Well, that's the thing. There are lifestyle factors involved, right? The alcohol, tobacco. They're more likely to engage in risky, macho behavior. Yeah, but as I say, if you look at the stats for Russia, you'll see a big difference. Here, it's not quite so bad, but even with the difference between black women and black men, there's still a big gap between those two, a bigger gap than between white men and white women, right? Let's look at this, median household income. So this is a rough kind of average of what people are taking home as their pay for one household. And you can pretty clearly see that from an American average of about $54,000 a year, white households are making considerably more, right? And black and Hispanic households, especially black households, are making pretty significantly less, right? $15,000 a year is a lot of money to not make over a year.
Wow, Asians do really
Yeah,
well.
good,
Wow.
good for you guys.
Why do they earn so much?
Why do you think we're seeing? Why do you think Asian households make more on average?
I think they will work harder because they're immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
You can say that about the Hispanic households as well.
Yeah, could be.
This is a guess, but could it be because a lot of the Asians that move here are very wealthy to begin with?
Could be. So it could have to do with the sort of character of immigration, right? So maybe we're seeing maybe Hispanic immigrants to the U.S. or just, well, Hispanic immigrants might be poorer coming in than Asian immigrants who may be richer. That might be part of it. And of course, wealth tends to as we'll talk about shortly, the U.S. is not necessarily a very socially mobile society, and so if you are poor, you tend to stay there. If you are rich, you tend to stay there. So there might be sort of a generational pattern. If people immigrate to the U.S. with money, then they may keep it, and if they immigrate to the U.S. without money, it might be hard to make it. What else might be going on here? Correct me if I'm wrong, please. But based on what I know, most Asian parents place a very high importance on education and a high importance on making money.
Yeah.
And so, and stereotypically, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, stereotypically, what I seem to notice is that they will push their kids pretty hard to succeed in school. And for what if whether that's good or bad or right or wrong, that can have an effect, right? If culturally, if parents put a high value on education and on earning, then in theory, their kids are going to be better educated and earn more, right? If that pressure is there, then that pressure is probably going to result in some patterns, right? So that might be the case as well. This could be an immigration thing. It could be a social mobility thing. It could also be a cultural. It could be. It could be. Daniel says yes. So there could be a cultural stress put on education and earning, right? And so that could be part of it. That could be part of it as well, right? Asian parents aren't telling their kids to follow their dream. Asian parents are telling their kids to get a good job that pays well. And, you know, maybe the statistics here suggest that that's happening. Maybe. I don't know for sure. Let's look at poverty rate. So poverty is measured in a bunch of different ways, but usually what it means is that if you're below the poverty line, you cannot afford your basic needs. So you cannot afford basic food, shelter, and clothing. So in the US, and this is shockingly high, or maybe not shocking if you know anything about the US, but 14% of their people are living below the poverty line. So 14% of Americans, almost 50 million of them, probably closer to 50 now during COVID, cannot provide for even their basic needs, food, clothing, shelter. But again, if you look at how that breaks down in terms of race, you'll see that Black Americans are much more likely to live in poverty, and white Americans are much less likely to live in poverty, right? Look at the criminal justice system. We talked about this a little bit already, but in the US, you'll see that the percent of the population, so white men are 64% of the population, and I think white people are 64% of America's population. I think that's what it is. But they're only 39% of the population in prison, right? So they're only 450 per 100,000. But look at Black men. Black men only make up 13% of Americans, and yet 40% of the people in jail are Black. It's a big difference, right? And again, those are big numbers, right? Because the US is not just taking a sample, they're looking at all the people. They have pretty clear records, right? They're looking at all the people in prison in the entire country. And so that's an alarm bell, right? There's a significant overrepresentation of Black people in prison and a significant underrepresentation of white people in prison. And the question, of course, is, why is that? Are Black people committing more crimes? Are they getting more police attention, and so maybe they're getting arrested more often? Are they getting more harsh sentences? Are white people getting arrested all the time, but are they not serving jail time? Are they getting probation or a fine or something else? There's all kinds of different reasons why this might be happening, but again, the statistic tells us that something's up, right? Something's going on here. 13% of your population should represent 13% of the people in prison, not 40. If it's 40, something else is happening here. Something's going wrong. I think we've been talking about that, actually, why these patterns exist. Is there anything you want to ask about or comment on with regard to some of those statistics? No? Okay. Let me see what's next here. Oh, but when we're looking at statistics like that or patterns like that, and we're trying to figure out what they mean, it's a good reminder of theory, right? Because theories kind of help us frame what we see, right? They help us to analyze and sort of explain things that we see in real life, right? And so depending on the theory we use, that will influence how we interpret those numbers, right? So in the past, and even in the present, some people might use what might be called a cultural deficit theory, right? So they might look at those numbers and they might see that Black Americans are, they make less money, and Black Americans are much more likely to wind up in prison than white Americans. And they might assume that that's just a cultural, there's something wrong with them, right? If they were better, then they wouldn't be in prison so often. Or if they just worked harder, they would make more money, right? So again, if you were to look at those numbers through the lens of a theory like this, then you would see that, well, these people are, clearly there's something wrong with them or their culture, and they just need to work harder, right? Or they just need to stop committing crimes or something like that, right? It would be And it would be very easy to explain these numbers this way, because it's very easy to just turn around and blame the people involved, right? You can just, it's a very easy explanation. And intuitively it makes sense, right? That's the problem. And so if somebody is in jail, it's like, well, they obviously committed a crime. And if you committed a crime, in theory, you have the choice not to commit the crime, right? So in some ways, the logic kind of holds up, right? Well, these people obviously chose to commit a crime, and that's why they're in jail, and so maybe next time don't commit the crime. But that's really overly simplistic, especially when you're looking at numbers that are across society, right? So again, if you're looking at one person who wound up in jail, yeah, maybe they committed a crime, maybe they were foolish or stupid, and maybe they shouldn't have done that, right? But when you're looking at an entire society where one racial group is vastly overrepresented in prison, that's a problem. And a simple explanation like that doesn't work, right? It's not a good enough explanation to explain everyone's experience, right? So again, what I'm asking you to do is consider oppression, right? Consider the fact that the United States has been a racist country and still is, unfortunately, and there are historical and institutional and cultural reasons for which, or that can help explain this data, I think, much better, right? So think about the experience of Black Americans in the US, even over the past 70 years. Don't even go back to slavery, just over the past, just since 1950, let's say. Many people of color attend underfunded schools. And so in the US, the school system, the school that you go to is funded by the property taxes of the people that live around the school. That's where the money for the school comes from. So if you live in a fancy, rich neighborhood, the property taxes are higher and your school gets more money. If you live in a poor neighborhood, the property taxes are lower, your school doesn't get as much money. Looking at those median incomes, who's more likely to live in a nice, rich neighborhood, white people or Black people?
You just said white neighborhood.
Yeah. So oh, sorry. So white people are more likely to live in a rich, wealthy neighborhood. What does that mean? It means that white kids are much more likely to go to a richer, well-funded school. Who do you think's more likely to go to university? White people, right? Who's more likely to get higher paying jobs? White people, right? People who have lower average incomes, like Black Americans on average, they live in poorer neighborhoods. They're going to go to poorer schools. They're not going to get as good of an education. They may not be able to go to university, or even if their marks are good enough, they might not have the money because university isn't free, as I'm sure we're all aware, right? They might not even be able to go to university. So they might get a lower paying job, right? And then they stay in a poor neighborhood. And then their kids go to a poorer school as well, and so on and so forth, right? So these things kind of continue to multiply. Healthcare is the same situation in the United States because they don't have a sort of a free healthcare system like we have here. In the States, you have to buy health insurance, right? So who do you think has the best insurance? Why do they have the best insurance?
More money.
Because they have more money, right? So if you have more money, you can buy better health insurance, and then your health will be better taken care of. People who are lower on the economic ladder have worse health insurance, or they don't have any health insurance, or they work a job where they can't actually take time off because if they're not at work, they're not getting paid, and if they're not getting paid, they can't put food on the table. So they're not going to go to the doctor anyway because they need to be at work, right? So again, they're going to have worse health outcomes. They're not going to live as long. There's other things which I don't think we have time to get into, but there's other ways in which Black people and people of color have been denied mortgages, denied loans, denied lines of credit. And mortgages are an important tool to build wealth, right? You buy a house, you know, you pay the mortgage, eventually it's paid off. Hopefully the value of the house goes up. Maybe you sell it later in life. Maybe your kids can inherit some money. Then they can buy their own house and so on and so forth. And so you can kind of build generational wealth through investments and through homes. But if you can't get a mortgage, or if your family is kind of doesn't have enough money to afford a down payment, then you get stuck, right? You can't sort of start building your wealth. And this has happened to generations of Black Americans as they've been kind of at the bottom of the economic ladder, and they haven't been able to gain bank loans because of discriminatory or racist practices. And so again, what are you going to do, right? You're stuck at the bottom and you can't work your way up. And again, we have lots of evidence of people of color, both in the US and Canada, receiving unequal and usually discriminatory treatment by all social institutions. So the education system, the healthcare system, criminal justice, policing, all of these things, right, in which people of color are at a disadvantage. And again, these things have wide-ranging effects and they have generational effects. And so again, what we're looking at here when we see statistics like we have is not, you know, the fact that one group of people doesn't work hard enough or aren't intelligent or whatever. What we're seeing is the effect of systemic racism, right? And when you have an entire group of people who are disadvantaged, and they're disadvantaged for generations, the effects continue to add up, right? They continue to multiply. And again, it's just like Jane Elliott and her blue-eyed and brown-eyed kids. If you look at the grade book, you will see that the blue-eyed kids are performing less well than the brown-eyed kids. But are the blue-eyed kids less smart? No. The data just looks like that because of the sort of, the prejudicial nature of the environment. And so it's the same thing happening here. It looks like Black people are doing less well, and they are, but that doesn't have to do with them inherently. It has to do with the surrounding system, right? That's what systemic racism is. I'm just going to show you a couple things and then we'll take a break because we've gone a little bit longer than I meant to. This was posted, this was an Instagram post the other day that I saw, and it summarizes what I'm trying to say, but much, much better than I can say it. Yeah, so I'll read it. So yeah, the problem is that white people see racism as conscious hate when racism is bigger than that, and we've said that, right? Racism is a complex system of social and political levers and pulleys set up generations ago to continue working on the behalf of whites at other people's expense, whether whites know or like it or not, right? Racism is an insidious cultural disease. It is so insidious that it doesn't care if you are a white person who likes Black people. It's still going to find a way to infect how you deal with people who don't look like you. And that's my point about sort of absorbing social messages into your subconscious and you're kind of not aware that they're there, right? Yes, racism looks like hate, but hate is just one manifestation. Privilege is another. Access is another. Ignorance is another. Apathy, sort of not caring. Apathy is another, and so on. So while I agree with people who say no one is born racist, it remains a powerful system that we're immediately born into. It's like being born into the air. You take it as soon as you breathe. It's not a cold that you can get over. There is no anti-racist certification class. It's a set of socioeconomic traps and cultural values that are fired up every time we interact with the world. It's a thing you have to keep scooping out of the boat of your life to keep from drowning in it. I know it's hard work, but it's the price you pay for owning everything. Oof. Better expressed than I could have done. But again, a lot of the ideas that we've talked about show up in that statement, right? Another couple things I thought I'd show you really quick. number one, oh, I thought I'd show you this little girl here. This is Maya Beaudry. So she's a young indigenous girl from, does it say?
Quebec.
Where?
Quebec.
From Quebec, yeah. And she started her own business. So she's making hair scrunchies, kind of, I think, using indigenous patterns and indigenous artwork. And I think she's been pretty successful so far, as near as I can tell. I'm going to do a little bit more homework on her, but I just saw it pop up on Instagram yesterday. And so, again, there's discrimination, there's racism, there's things that we need to fix immediately, if not sooner. But there's also some success stories going on as well, right? And Maya Beaudry here is one of those success stories so far. Although not all stories are successful. You may have heard about this. This happened just a couple days ago or last week in Vancouver, where an Indigenous man and his granddaughter went to BMO in order to open a bank account for her and to do a couple other things. But there was some confusion about their Indian status card. The bank felt it was a forgery, a fake, and they called the cops. And the cops showed up and handcuffed both of them for some reason. And it was a whole ordeal. And again, nothing was wrong, but apparently. And so, but of course the point is that why did the bank not recognize government issued Indian status cards as identification? Because they are. Your status card is a legal piece of ID from the government. Why didn't the bank recognize it? And two, why was there a need to call the cops, and why was there a need to handcuff this poor man and his 12 or 13-year-old granddaughter? They don't look dangerous to me. And again, the question is, if they were white, would they have been handcuffed? Right? So again, this story is still unfolding. So this just happened a couple days ago. A bunch of Indigenous people were protesting inside BMO downtown, I think yesterday or today. So the story is unfolding as we speak. But again, we can still see, unfortunately, some discrimination and prejudice against Indigenous people. And the last thing I'll show you is this one here. This is the exhibition for Kent Monkman. We met Kent Monkman in that 8th Fire documentary. He was the artist. So his artwork is being shown at Museum of Anthropology, which is on the UBC campus. So if you are interested in artwork or Kent Monkman or any of those things, you can go and see the actual paintings, because they're currently on display there. Okay, that is it. Let's take a little break. We'll come back and we'll talk about something different. Okay? All right. Sorry I went long. Okay, and we're back. So there's different kinds of oppression, as we know, that can go under the social justice heading, and we've talked about ableism, we've talked about sexism, we talked about racism, and I wanted to do a little bit on religious oppression and on classism. And we don't have a ton of class left. Haha, get it? We don't have. Yeah, no, you don't have to laugh for that one. That's not funny at all. We don't have a lot of time left here, and so I just have enough room to kind of introduce both of these topics to you, and then we'll just see. Yeah, we'll just.
This is the last oppression, right?
I've got one more actually. I've got classism as well. So we'll just have a couple days on this and a couple days on classism. I've been meaning to kind of build out these sections a little more, but there's so much interesting stuff to talk about with like racism and sexism and ableism that it's like, oh, I don't have enough room in the course to add all this other stuff, but I don't know. Anyway, here we go. So, religious oppression, as you might have guessed, is this, right? It's a systematic inequality, just like the sexism and racism were, but here we have people being treated differently or having different opportunities or advantages or disadvantages based on the religion or their religious beliefs, right? And so we can see this inequality manifested in kind of a number of ways. It could have to do with laws that sort of differentially apply to people. And again, it can occur in societies that are a little less tolerant, but it can even occur in societies that are more tolerant, societies like here in Canada. I'm going to give you some background here just so you know some things, because we'll read an article, I think tomorrow, and we'll talk about this, but you'll need to understand a few things about how Canada works. And so, like I think all countries, Canada has a constitution, right? What's a constitution?
Basically, like the law.
They are laws, yeah. And what's so special about these laws?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I don't.
The way I like to explain constitutions. So constitutions are laws. They're the highest laws in the country, and they basically explain. I like to, you've played a board game, right? Like Monopoly or something. I like to explain it as basically they're the rules for playing the game of Canada. Okay? So who the players are, what the players are allowed to do, what the players are not allowed to do, how the game will proceed. That's what the Constitution does, right? And so here in Canada, among other things, the Constitution defines who the government is and what powers the government has and what powers the government does not have, right? And the American Constitution does the same thing. It tells us how the government is constructed and what parts of the government are allowed to do what things. Here in Canada, we have that, so we have kind of a normal constitution in that it lays out the basic rules for how Canada works, but also we have a charter of rights and freedoms. And so when our constitution came home from Great Britain, it was passed in the British House of Parliament originally because we were a colony of Britain. But in 1982, Justin Trudeau's dad, Pierre, as Prime Minister, managed to bring our constitution back home. And so only in 1982 did we gain control of our own constitution again, which seems really late, but better late than never, I guess. But inside that constitution is a charter of rights and freedoms. And so it defines what the people in Canada, again, what their rights and freedoms are. And so there's a bunch of, actually I'll jump ahead and I'll show you. There's a very, where is it now, where is it? No, there. This is kind of the more simplified version. There's a more legally version of what this is, but this is kind of a poster that you'll see posted around, and it defines in kind of very simple language for anyone to read what what are the rights and freedoms of people in Canada? And so you can see there's some fundamental freedoms there. There's democratic rights, like the right to vote, the right to run for office. There's mobility rights about being able to go anywhere you want in Canada and being able to enter and leave Canada freely. There's legal rights that you have, you know, the right to a fair trial and, you know, the right to be against arrest without cause and all that kind of stuff. There's equality rights, which of course I think we'll talk about. There's official language rights in Canada. So we have 2 official languages, right? English and French. We have minority language educational rights. So people who speak languages other than French or English can receive education in their own language. Then we have some enforcement and some general stuff and application of the Charter. So this is kind of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And again, I think it's really cool that it is part of the Constitution, because constitutions are difficult to change, right? You can pass a law, so Justin Trudeau can pass a law in Parliament, and then Justin Trudeau can get voted out, another prime minister can get voted in, and they can just overturn that law, right? They just have a quick vote and they can overturn it, no problem. Constitutions are and should be much more difficult to change, right? They're the highest law in the land, and all other laws that we pass have to be in alignment with that, okay? As a little added tidbit of information, if you want to change the Canadian Constitution, you have to change it according to a 750 rule. And so you need 7 of the provinces to agree to it, and those 7 provinces have to represent 50% of Canada's population, at least. So without that, you cannot suggest a change. We've tried to change our Constitution a couple of times in the 1990s, I believe, maybe once in the late 80s and once in the 90s, because the Constitution as it is, Quebec never signed on to it. So the province of Quebec didn't entirely like the Constitution as it was, and so they chose not to sign it, but every other province did. And so Brian Mulroney, I think a couple times, he was our prime minister in the 80s, he tried to change the Constitution to make Quebec happier so that they would sign on to it, but both of those attempts failed. So the provinces weren't able to come to an agreement on on changes, and so none of them passed. And so we still have the original one from '82. We've made a couple of attempts to change it, but those have been unsuccessful so far, so it's still the same. But anyway, nope, before that, we'll get to those guys. Well, we'll get to that too. Okay, too far. Right, so in the fundamental freedoms section, that's what's kind of applicable here for talking about religious oppression, because you can see everyone has the following fundamental freedoms. You have freedom of conscience and religion. You have freedom of thought and belief and opinion and expression, including freedom of the press and other media communication, as long as it's not hate speech, but otherwise. Freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association. So again, all Canadians have their own beliefs and opinions, and they're free to practice those beliefs as long as they don't infringe on the rights of other people. One more thing before I move on that I think is really cool about Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms is that basically they apply to everyone within Canada, not just citizens. So all of those rights and freedoms that we just saw on the screen, if you're here in Canada, they apply to you as well. You get all of them, except for 2. Do you know what the 2 are? Can you guess? 2 rights that I have as a Canadian citizen that you do not have as a non-citizen.
Voting.
Yeah, voting and running for office, so I can do that and you cannot. What else? There's one more. Huh? Huh? Press and meet? Nope. Nope. So I can run for office and vote, and you may not run for office or vote until you're. What else? There's one more. There's one more thing I can do that you can't. When you came to Canada, what did you need?
Study permit.
Yeah, you need a study permit or a visa, right? So I can enter and leave Canada freely. You all? No, right? You need, depending on the country you come from, you sometimes you can just come right in with your passport. Sometimes you might need a visa depending on the country, right? So not you can't just come into Canada without permission if you're not Canadian, right? But Canadians can enter or leave freely, and we can vote. But except for those two exceptions, all the other ones apply to you, right? All of these and all the other ones too, which I think is great. So if you're in Canada, these rights apply to you. You don't have to be a Canadian citizen to get them. So with religious oppression here, we should probably identify who the dominant group and who the minoritized groups are, right? And so most people in Canada, or at least the dominant group in Canada, are Christians. So Canada was kind of born or created by people who were Christian in some way. And even though kind of the average religiousness of Canadians is kind of declining, or has been declining in the past few years, still Christians are kind of the minority, right? So we've got about half of Canadians who are, to some degree Christian. Some people, of course, are very religious and they go to church and they pray and they do all these things. Some people are a little bit more, they're a little less committed. Some people were just brought up in Christian households, and so they identify that way. But but Christians are the dominant group in Canada. Although, as you can see, an increasingly large group of people don't identify with any religion. Yeah, so about 55% of adults, Canadian adults, identify themselves as Christian. 29% of those are 29% are Catholic, 18% are Protestant. If you don't know, there's not a huge difference from the outside anyway, from Catholicism and Protestantism. They both believe in the same God and Jesus and that whole kind of story. They just have they have a few different ideas about they have a few different ideas, but they're, for our purposes, they're very similar. 30% of Canadians are non-religious, right? So they're atheists, so they don't believe in any sort of God or higher power. They're agnostic, so they're kind of not really sure, or not really sure of any sort of higher power, or people who are, maybe a little bit spiritual in some way, but they're not strongly religiously affiliated. But of course, as Canada is taking in about 300,000 immigrants every year, our religious composition is starting to change, right? So you have an increasing number of Canadians who are Muslims, who are Hindus, who are Sikhs, who are Jains, who are Buddhists. And so, those 5 groups are currently 8% of Canadian adults. But I guess we'll see if that percentage starts to creep up as immigration continues, right? So again, we may have a changing demographic here, but at the moment, Christians are still in the minority, right? And again, to be in the dominant group means what it always means, is that dominant groups have control of, they've had historical control, they have control of social messaging, and they usually have control of government institutions as well, right? And so that's true of Canada. Basically, people who are Christians or from Christian backgrounds have control of these social institutions, right? And so the people who are in minoritized groups are basically everyone who is not Christian. But I would say most specifically the people who are vulnerable here are Muslims, Jewish people, Sikhs, and Hindus, I would say are probably the most vulnerable. And I think probably the reason that some of these groups are the most vulnerable is because they are more visible in society, right? So these groups often will wear clothing or head coverings or things that mark them as members of their faith, of members of their religion, right? And so if you see, here's a I think he's from Toronto, actually, a Toronto police officer wearing a dastar or wearing a turban. That kind of identifies him as a Sikh, right, to the entire world. Here we have a woman with a headscarf on, and so I don't know for sure, but the sort of assumption is that she's a Muslim woman. And here we have some Jewish guys hanging out with their little yarmulke on their head, right? So again, some religious groups are dominant, some are minoritized, and some are more visible. Some are more visible in society than others, right? And so if you look at me, you have no idea what my religious affiliation is, right? I could be very strongly Catholic or strongly Protestant, or I could be agnostic or atheist or whatever. You can't tell what I am because there's no obvious evidence of my faith, right? But some people do wear kind of jewelry or dress in certain ways that communicate their religious faith to the community, right? And so I would say that they're in the minoritized group, but they're also more vulnerable because they're very visible in society. You know what I mean? Yeah, okay. Right. And so this is kind of a challenge. This is the last thing I'll say probably today. This is kind of an ongoing challenge for Canada, I would say, not just with regard to religion, but with regard to culture and ethnicity and language and values, is that Canada is trying to, I think we're trying to be a sort of inclusive, multicultural country, right? A country made up of all kinds of different people. And so the question is, how do you get all of those different people and different traditions and values to live and work together in harmony, right? I think that's the big challenge of Canada. And I'm not saying that we're necessarily doing it wrong or doing it bad, but that's always going to be our challenge, is that how do you take people from all over, put them into one group, get them to work together, even though, you know, they might have very different, again, beliefs, values, traditions. Yeah, how do you get those people to work together? And so this issue of religious oppression will kind of give us at least a small example to kind of think about that question. Okay. But I think that might be all I'll say today, because I've talked a lot and you've had to listen to me a lot, and I apologize for that. I usually try not to talk all day, but that happened today. So before I sign off, are there any questions? No questions? Quiz Wednesday?
Next Wednesday?
Next Wednesday. I'll post it in Microsoft Teams. No class Friday. I'm so sorry. I know you'll miss me. Yeah, I know. Don't cry, okay? Yeah, okay, thanks. Okay, that is all for today. I hope everyone has a nice afternoon, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye.